Chapter 20. Carl. Carl glanced up at the approach of thundering hooves, and his hand fell to his side where he kept his gun. That was too many horses to be Elizabeth returning, and though it hadn't happened often, there had been a few times when roving gangs of robbers had ridden through his field. The first time it had happened, he'd been woefully unprepared and nearly taken a bullet to the shoulder. Thankfully, he'd been on his horse and able to outrun them by taking a shortcut he knew about. Ever since then, though, he'd taken to wearing his gun when working outside so as not to be caught unprepared again. As soon as he recognized the men on the horses, though, his hand relaxed. He didn't know what the sheriff and the deputy might want, but he wasn't in any danger. A moment later, they pulled to a stop a few feet from him.
"Afternoon, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" "Afternoon, Carl. I wish we were here on different terms, but we need to ask you a few questions. You recently got married, didn't you?"
Carl's brow furrowed.
"I did, but what does that have to do with anything? I'm pretty sure getting married is still legal around here."
The sheriff chuckled.
"It is, but your wife is not from around here. Is that correct?" "That's true. She answered my ad and came from Chicago."
The sheriff nodded.
"Do you know anything about her past there?"
"Some. I know her father died and she didn't have any family. The rest wasn't important. Are you going to tell me what's going on?"
"There's been a situation."
That got Carl's attention and adrenaline flooded his veins.
"A situation? Is Elizabeth okay? Did something happen at the store?"
Images of her being shot like Pauline had been filled his head, and he fought the urge to jump on his horse and race into town. The sheriff held up his hand and shook his head.
"Nothing like that. Elizabeth is fine. It's Doc Moore's clinic."
"The doc's clinic? I don't understand."
"Someone broke into the clinic last night and stole some medical supplies."
Carl's jaw fell open. "And you think Elizabeth had something to do with it? My wife is not a thief." Though he didn't like it, Carl could understand their questions. Sage Creek had seen few new people over the years, so they were a tight-knit community who all knew each other. But the sheriff casting dispersions on his wife, even if they had married for the sake of convenience, didn't sit well with him.
"No one is saying that,"
the sheriff said, his tone taking on a placating edge.
"But there has been talk of her having a disagreement with Mrs. Cook after finding out about your history. We're just checking all the boxes. Elizabeth claims she was home with you last night. Can you confirm that information?"
Carl didn't know where this line of questioning was headed, but he knew the sheriff was a good man, which was the only reason he continued to answer.
"Yes, sir. She was here all night."
The sheriff glanced over at the deputy and nodded.
"All right. And can you confirm that no medical supplies have shown up here unexpectedly?"
Carl locked gazes with Deputy Masterson. He hadn't been exactly thrilled when James had taken over the deputy position when Jesse stepped down, but he'd had no say. It wasn't that James wasn't a decent man, but he did have a habit of jumping to conclusions before getting all the information.
"I can confirm that as well." "Very well. We'll pursue our other leads."
"What other leads?" James asked, speaking for the first time.
"She is the only lead, the only one who makes sense."
"Perhaps you should check in with Miss Johnson, as it seems she's the one who informed Elizabeth of my previous feelings for Mrs. Cook. Now, I don't know what she'd have against Elizabeth or Mrs. Cook or even myself, but as she inserted herself, perhaps it's worth asking."
"Will do, Carl. Thanks for your time."
Carl watched the men ride away before he returned to his job, but he couldn't help wondering about Elizabeth. Had they harassed her already? And if they had, how must she be feeling? The protective part of him wanted to ride into town and check on her. But Elizabeth had not only proven herself to be independent, she'd pushed him away when she found out about Emma. He doubted she would appreciate him riding in like some knight in shining armor trying to rescue her. No, he would just have to wait until she returned and check on her then. It was shortly after he'd finished dinner, and well before he expected her to arrive, that Elizabeth returned. He could tell by the grim expression on her face that her day had not gone as well as she'd hoped.
"Are you all right?"
he asked, as he held out his hand to help her down. "Just peachy, if you consider everyone in town thinking I'm a thief all right. Do you know they honestly believe I broke into Emma's clinic and stole medical supplies?" Carl nodded and adjusted his hat.
"I do, but only because the sheriff and Deputy Masterson paid me a visit earlier."
Elizabeth's eyes widened, and her expression, though he wouldn't have thought it possible, darkened. "Do you mean to tell me they rode out here to ask questions about me?"
"They did, but while they were just doing their jobs, I told them they were barking up the wrong tree."
Elizabeth sighed and brushed her hand down her skirt. "Thank you, but little good it will do me. Rebecca made sure everyone in town heard about the break-in and the deputies suspecting me. Then she publicly ridiculed Emma for helping me hang signs about my business. Not that anyone will want to buy a dress from me now."
"You just have to give them time. I don't know what Rebecca's problem is, but I know that the people of this town are decent folks, and when they realize you are innocent—"
"That's just it, though, Carl. Why do they have to realize I'm innocent? Why am I guilty first? That's not the way it's supposed to work." Carl looked at her, wondering if she realized what she'd just said. "What?" she asked.
"I agree that you should be innocent first, but shouldn't I have been too?"
For a second, she stared at him, and then he saw the realization hit. Her eyes widened and her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my goodness, Carl, you're right. I should have talked to you and not yelled at you. I'm so sorry." Carl smiled and stepped toward her, but he didn't touch her. Though she had apologized, he wasn't sure if she was ready to rekindle the affection they'd started.
"I accept your apology, and I want you to know that the people of this town will issue the same kind of apology when they realize they've been wrong. It's a small town, Elizabeth, and most people here grew up together. They just need time to get to know you."
She pulled back her shoulders and lifted her chin in the air. "Well, I'm not going anywhere. I will not be falsely accused and run out of town." With that, she headed toward the homestead. Carl sighed. Married life was certainly harder than he'd thought it would be.